to another MedCram lecture, and we can see here the numbers are increasing, but slowly. Here on the Worldometer website, 75,730 total. Deaths, 2,128, recovered 16,000. If we look at the active cases and the closed cases, you can see that the number of recovered has gone up slightly and seems to be doing that on a daily basis. If we look at the total worldwide cases, you can see here that they are dwindling overall. But in looking at the cases that are outside of China, we can see that they continue to increase. In terms of the number of deaths, unfortunately, those continue to be increasing pretty much at a linear rate. I want to update you on the situation with the Diamond Princess cruise ship that's docked outside of Japan. There was a statement put out by the CDC commending the government of Japan for the fact that they quarantine patients, but there's been a lot of international criticism of how Japan actually handled this. And there's been an intervention, and basically the consensus, if you read between the lines, is that this did not work very well. There's currently more than 100 U.S. citizens either on board the Diamond Princess or in hospitals in Japan, and they've been placed under restrictions. They're saying that they will be required to wait 14 days before coming home, before they're permitted to go on board flights. However, if an individual does make it to the United States before that 14-day period ends, they will be subject to a mandatory quarantine until they completed that 14-day period. So the CDC is coming out with that statement, and they want to make sure that everyone's aware that they are taking this seriously. I also want to quickly highlight a letter that was submitted to the New England Journal of Medicine, dated yesterday, February 19. It was an interesting look at about 18 patients, 9 men and 9 women, meeting 59 years of age. And what they did was they looked at viral loads in the upper respiratory tract to see what they were based on when the symptoms began. And now these were people from Wuhan, and all of them except for one were symptomatic. There was one person that was asymptomatic, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But you can see here the graphs of the CT value, which is basically the viral load. And on the x-axis here is the number of days since the onset of symptoms, 0 being here on the far left. And what you can basically see is that the viral load was quite high in the very early days of the symptoms, and then tapers off, almost all of them being undetectable here towards 14 days. Now, please don't confuse these days as the incubation period. This has nothing to do with the incubation period. This has to do with how long the symptoms last once you get the symptoms. Incubation period has to do with how long it is between infection and the onset of symptoms. The other thing to notice here at the bottom is, it may be difficult to see, but in terms of throat swabs versus nasal swabs, there was a higher viral count in the nasal swabs in general than there was in the throat swabs, meaning that this virus tends to potentially congregate in the upper airways. There was one patient that was tested and was asymptomatic, and they say here that the viral load that was detected in the asymptomatic patient was similar to that in the symptomatic patients, which suggests that the transmission potential of asymptomatic or minimally symptomatic patients. And this is confirming what we had discussed earlier at the beginning of this outbreak, that potentially can be spread by asymptomatic individuals. And we will put a link in the description below to this article as well as the CDC article. Another article that was submitted on the same day yesterday was a perspective that was written by a number of physicians and epidemiologists on their perspective of defining the epidemiology of COVID-19 and how more studies are needed. One of the interesting aspects that they mention here is they may need to do testing in people that may not meet the current definitions, which is someone who has traveled from that particular area of China and has symptoms. And they say here, a key point of these recommendations is that viral testing should not be used only for clinical care. I think that's an interesting point. If we really want to find out what the scope is of the infection, especially in China, that there's going to have to be a lot of people who are asymptomatically tested to see whether or not they had the virus at some point. Anyway, I leave that perspective there for your consideration. In future updates, we'll plan on tackling the molecular biology of coronavirus and contrast it and compare it to other viruses. And that might give us a little bit of information about what this virus likes to do. Please join us at medcram.com for our course on the coronavirus, also multiple other courses. Thanks for joining us. Hi, I'm Dr. Roger Schwell.
Cram.com.
Welcome to another MedCram SARS-CoV-2 COVID-19 update. We had a good conference, but it's good to be back. What we're going to talk about in this update are the new cases in South Korea, the new criteria once again for the diagnosis. A lot of you have been asking questions about infants and mother-infant transmission, and we'll talk about that. We've got some data there that we'll talk about, and also getting back to the source of where this virus actually came from. We'll talk about some data there as well. Once again, really appreciate all of the comments, all of the questions, and they are very good questions that you all have. I'm keeping track of those as we go. So here is again the map. Total deaths, well over 2,000. Total recovered is around 18,000, and we can see the graphs here. If we go to the worldometer, they have similar numbers. We've already talked about how these numbers are underestimating this. We don't know how much it's underestimating, but we may have a better understanding once we start doing serologies, because that will test for antibodies to the virus, and that will tell us a much better distribution of the population has seen this virus. We'll talk more about that as we go. Active cases and closed cases. Closed cases 20,000. Looks like 89% of those have recovered. In the active cases, they're saying that 43,888 are in mild condition. We just don't know where we're going with those at this point. If we click on the graph for those active cases, you can see that they're actually decreasing according to the statistics coming out of China. We've got here daily new cases. And remember, we had this big jump on February 12th. We'll talk more about that. Since that time, it's been decreasing. Total cases outside of China are still continuing to increase. And that is, of course, a concern. If you exclude mainland China in the daily cases, we're still seeing some of the highest new case reports here most recently. And that brings us to this BBC News article talking about the South Korean sect that was identified recently as a hotbed. About 30 of the 53 cases identified today in South Korea came from the city of Daegu and was tied to one 61-year-old woman who tested positive for the virus earlier in the week. She belonged to this religious organization and is probably responsible for at least 30 of those cases, and so they are undergoing quarantine. We'll put a link in the description below to this article. Also in the news, we'll talk about the Diamond Princess ship. 2 people from Japan who were infected on that ship have died. They were both in their 80s. Let's move to this. Confusion mounts over China's counting methods as coronavirus numbers swing wildly. And this is interesting because, as it mentions here in the article, we have Hubei province reporting 349 cases. That's in the entire province. And yet, at the same time, in the capital of that province, Wuhan, there's 605 new cases all by itself. So what is it that is going on here? It seems as though the provincial government is not confirming cases unless they actually have the genetic testing. Whereas what's going on in the city of Wuhan is they're still going by the newly updated criteria, which is allowing physicians to diagnose, even though they don't have genetic testing, they still have these scans which show pneumonia in these patients with clinical signs that make it suspicious. If you read the article, it does go into the fact that there was a sudden spike in the case numbers on February 12th, which we discussed in a previous video, was most likely due to the relaxing of the very stringent diagnostic criteria. It's not a coincidence that the new officials from the Chinese Communist Party took over on the 12th or around that time. And there's been this thought that perhaps they wanted to clear the slate, get as many diagnoses on the books as possible. And there's this quote from the article which basically states that the party boss of Wuhan was saying if there's one more case were to be found in a household, that district's party secretary would be held accountable. And that's to show that there is probably a real push to try to get the numbers down now that the new policy makers in Wuhan have taken over. Anyway, we will put a link to this article also in the description below so you can read it for yourself. Okay, let's move to an article that was published back on the 14th of February in JAMA, which is the Journal of the American Medical Association, titled Novel Coronavirus Infection in Hospitalized Infants Under 1 Year of Age in China. So here the N number was only 9 patients, but it's because they're not really seeing a lot of COVID-19 infections in these patients. So out of 75,000, they've only got about 100 or so on the books in the pediatric population. So that could be because maybe the pediatric population isn't as susceptible. And when they looked at these 9, first of all, they found that only 4 of them had fever. Only 2 of them had upper respiratory infection symptoms. One of them was completely asymptomatic, and they were tested because the family had tested positive, and they wanted to make sure. In terms of the number of infants with severe complications or on the ventilator or in the ICU, the number was 0. Again, we'll leave a link to this article in the description as well so you can read it for yourself. So with all of these infections going on, the CDC has put out some answers to questions about pregnant women. One of the questions was, are infants born to mothers at increased risk? And so that's an interesting question. It looks as though, based on limited case reports, adverse infant outcomes or preterm birth have been reported among infants born to mothers positive for COVID-19 during pregnancy. However, it is not clear that these outcomes were related to maternal infection, and at this time the risk of adverse infant outcomes is not known. Here's another question. Can pregnant women with COVID-19 pass the virus to their fetus or newborn? And it seems as though, in limited recent case series, none of the infants have tested positive for the virus that caused COVID-19. And additionally, when they looked at the amniotic fluid, they were not able to find virus in there either. Of course, when the birthing process occurs, there can be a mixing of bodily fluids, and that could be the source of infection in an infant after the birthing process. With Zika virus, that can cross the placenta. It appears as though coronavirus does not at this point. Well, that brings us to one of the last stories that we want to talk about. This was a really kind of concerning article that I saw here on NPR. New research. Bats harbor hundreds of coronaviruses, and spillovers aren't rare. We'll put a link to this in the description below. So what is this? Here you can see these researchers actually taking samples of saliva from bats and actually taking a rectal sample. And when were they doing this? Not recently, but 3 years ago, when they were doing studies because of the SARS outbreak from 2002, which was linked to bats. So this story talks about an organization called Eco Health Alliance that was going out in Borneo, but they also did research in China at the time, and they collected specimens from bats, and what they found was actually quite disturbing. they found that there were over 400 different species of coronaviruses in these bats. Now remember, these bats live in caves, they live together, and they commune together, and so there's a lot of crossover that can occur. The previous thinking on this was that these coronaviruses could not really jump into humans because they had to go into something that was closer to humans, or that had to get a mutation so it could bind to human receptors, for instance, the ACE2 receptor that we see in SARS and actually the virus that causes COVID-19. They thought that spillovers were rare. What they found was concerning because they looked at these viruses and they found that these things could infect human cells. In fact, they took some of these coronaviruses that they found in these bats, they put them on a petri dish that were lined with human cells, and the coronaviruses, at least some of them, could infect these human cells without a problem. So then they decided to go visit some humans that were living around these caves where the bats were, to see if, in fact, these coronaviruses had already jumped into humans. And when they went into the caves to do the research, they found water bottles around the caves because in the summertime it's kind of cool and humans tend to go in there. And also the people that were living in the area said, oh yeah, bats fly into the house and sometimes we kill them. So there is this crossover. Well, when they did test the humans for signs, symptoms, genetic traces of these coronaviruses, they found them. And so they concluded that spillover does occur. Of course, this is kind of in a rural area. And so this may not explode into an epidemic because it's not in a city center, and the symptoms may be very mild. Okay, now fast forward here 3 or 4 years later. Of course, when this new coronavirus breaks out, what they did was they took the RNA from this coronavirus and they compared it to the 400 different strains of the coronavirus that they identified earlier in China. And it says here they found an extremely close match. They said, in fact, that a viral taxonomist would probably call it the same virus species. They say that suggests that this current outbreak, which has infected tens of thousands of people, could have come, here's the word, could have come directly from bats. There is a larger takeaway, he says, that these bat SARS-related coronaviruses are actively spilling over into the human population. Not all of them will spark a deadly pandemic, but the more frequent these spillovers, the greater the chances that this could potentially be happening. In future updates, we're going to talk about the molecular biology of coronavirus, how it infects the cell. Let's get down to the nitty-gritty, compare it to the behavior of other viruses that have been brought up in this discussion, for instance, HIV, etc. And how is it that these viruses do different things? What is it that they do? What are their targets? That's what we're going to try to answer. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to another MedCram lecture. We're going to talk about the coronavirus update, and we see here 75,000 total confirmed cases based on the data from the WHO and the CDC coming out of China. Total deaths over 2,000, total recovered 14,772. If we look at the worldometer, as it's correctly pronounced, we can see here there's active, inactive cases. The closed cases, 16,814. 88% of those have been recovered or discharged, and 12% deaths in the closed cases so far. Of course, these numbers are underreported. Most of those cases were mild cases, however. If we break those cases down again into the difference between what's going on in China and what's going on outside of China, we can get another picture. You can see here the trends is that every day there seems to be more and more new cases, whereas inside of China the number of cases are actually diminishing, as we can see here overall. If we go up to total deaths, over 2,000 deaths total. I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in terms of what the labs are doing to fight coronavirus, the COVID-19 disease specifically. Nice interview here on NPR regarding antibodies. First, I want to talk a little bit about antibodies and how they're made. So you have these B cells, and they each have different receptors on these B cells. These B cells are made to do one thing really, and that is to make antibodies. And these receptors on the cells are there to receive any type of antigen that you might come in contact with. An antigen could be a protein of a virus or a protein of a bacteria, etc., etc. And what is really quite amazing is that you have so many different types of receptors on millions and millions of B cells that just about any kind of foreign protein that gets introduced into your body will make a B cell against that. And so here we can see that each B cell has a different antigen receptor, and the antigen receptors of only one B cell will combine with that antigen. So if you have a virus, that virus is going to stimulate its particular B cell, and it will activate, and it will get help from T cells, cytokines, and it will cause this cell to divide and rapidly enlarge into a huge clonal representation of that B cell. So you have thousands, millions of these B cells, and all these B cells do is they produce antibodies, and these antibodies go out and attack cells that have the virus in it or the virus itself. And finally, when the infection is done, then these B cells just kind of go away, but there's always a certain amount of a population of these B cells ready to strike again if that virus comes again. And this is typically how it works with a particular virus. So if you get a vaccine against the virus like polio, if you get a vaccine against the virus like the hepatitis B virus, that vaccine goes through the same way. Here you get an antigen stimulating a B cell. Of course, when we give a vaccine, in some of the cases, we give a vaccine that has just the protein without the virus, so you don't get the actual disease, and that causes your B cells to make a lot of these antibodies in preparation for if you ever were to be infected with that virus, you'll be ready to make an immune response. Of course, sometimes what happens is the virus may mutate, and so that the proteins are different enough that the antibodies that you have against those proteins may not be as effective. And this is kind of what happens with colds. You might get multiple colds in a year, and it's possibly because, well, it could be a different virus, a rhinovirus versus a regular coronavirus. Or it could be a rhinovirus that's mutated enough so that the former immunization that you got against the virus is no longer effective because it's mutated. Well, going back to this interview, what they're looking at is drugs that will prevent the virus from replicating. But there's an interesting company that they're looking at called AbCellera, which they identify antibodies from patients who have already recovered from infection because their finely tuned immune systems have already figured out a way to clear the virus. And so what they can do is they can look through millions of different immune cells and find the one that is right for coronavirus. In fact, what they've done, and this is kind of amazing, is they've taken mice And instead of making mouse antibodies, these mice are actually using human immune system cells to make not mouse antibodies, but to actually make fully human antibodies. And that's just amazing. So, of course, the next step is to inject these coronaviruses into these mice and start getting these antibodies out and actually seeing whether or not they work, testing them in trials, and then seeing whether or not this antibody against the coronavirus, specifically the one that makes the COVID-19 disease, otherwise known as SARS-CoV-2, is going to be effective. So this is one of the treatments that's on the horizon. And the reason why this is really important for us to get, as we see here in this USA Today article, looking again at that data from China that we talked about yesterday, they're looking at statistics here and they're saying that the coronavirus is 20 times more lethal than the flu based on the case fatality rate, as the death toll, as we talked about, passes 2,000. We can see here that based on the calculations that they were doing, the global death toll from the virus was listed at 2009 as of Tuesday evening, and that the total infections rose to more than 75,000. That if you do the calculation, the overall death rate for the virus was 2.3%. However, the season's flu death in the United States was at about 0.1%, making this, of course, more deadly than the regular flu, but not as deadly as the SARS outbreak back in 2002, which was at around 10%. Unfortunately, we have to talk about another physician who's died in China, Dr. Liu. He was the director of a Chinese hospital at the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak and was one of the neurosurgeons as well. So these B cells and how they become plasma cells and how they secrete immunoglobulins or antibodies, it's all very specific and distinct, including how viruses infect the human cells. This is something that we'd like to go into a little more detail. There's been a lot of questions about immunity and what happens after someone recovers. And we've seen some examples here in the United States of people who have recovered, specifically the gentleman in Washington. But there's been some questions, some rumors, and some claims that people can get the virus twice and that, for instance, people can have a lot worse reaction the second time around and that there may not be immunity. I haven't seen any reports of that. And so it's very difficult to come up with an answer to that question. I think it might be a little early in the course to see if that is in fact happening. One thing I will make a point of, however, is that oftentimes when someone gets a viral infection, their ability to withstand secondary bacterial infections is reduced. And so it's not uncommon to have secondary bacterial infections when someone has a severe viral infection. And so I wanted to end this update with an excellent article that was published on the 12th of February 2020 on the practical recommendations for critical care and anesthesia teams caring for novel coronavirus patients. And I will put a link in the description below. This article that is written in Canada talks about their experience with the SARS virus back in 2002. And it talks about very practical things to do, for instance, in the intensive care unit, what kind of personal protective equipment to be wearing, how the flow of air in these rooms, whether or not they're negative or positive pressure rooms, are very important. For instance, if you are doing, generally speaking, an operation that's in an operating room and that room is run under positive pressure ventilation, something that, of course, you would never want to have happen if you're doing an operation on somebody with this kind of virus. And so they talk about switching those kind of patients into negative pressure rooms to do the operation so that you don't infect other people in the hospital. And so I think it's an excellent read for physicians, healthcare providers who are going to be taking care of these coronavirus or COVID-19 patients. It also talks about when to use N95 masks versus these powered air purifying respirators, otherwise known as PAPRs, and who should be wearing them, and talking about, for instance, hot zones warm zones and cold zones, hot zones being in the patient's room specifically where there's negative pressure ventilation, warm zones when you're outside the patient's room but still in the intensive care unit, and then finally cold zones when you're outside of the intensive care unit. So I think this is really important information, and again, we will put a link to it in the description below. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening. I'm still reporting on the coup. But first, a brief appeal. This is not an advertisement. Please view that at the end of this report. This is an urgent appeal for some help from a Series 7 qualified trader. I am trying to help save a person's home from foreclosure. We need you to verify a simple registration number. This needs to be accomplished in a few days, so please email me at stillreport@gmail.com if you can help out. According to a story in yesterday's The Federalist, former National Security Advisor John Bolton admitted on Wednesday that nothing in his book would have had a significant impact on President Trump's impeachment trial. In the final days of the impeachment trial in the Senate, sections of Bolton's book was leaked to the New York Times, accusing Trump of withholding nearly $400 million in military aid to Ukraine. The leak, however, came on the same day that Bolton's new book became available for online pre-order. This was no coincidence. It was nothing more than a publicity stunt. If it wasn't just a money-grubbing stunt, Bolton should have derided the use of his name in such a stunt. He could have shut it down the day it hit the wires, but instead he was silent, aware that all this was great, long-lasting publicity about his upcoming book. That's right, as America's freedom literally teetered on a knife's edge, Bolton and/or his publisher tried to gain a small financial benefit from ginning up the calls for continued investigations. If two of the final Republican senators had decided to support that measure to call Bolton to testify, then the impeachment trial would still be going on today. Calling witness after witness at the behest of Schiff and Nadler, trying to improve on the two flawed articles of impeachment delivered from the House to the U.S. Senate. Bolton now attempts to shed responsibility for this hugely irresponsible behavior by telling a crowd at Vanderbilt University that even if he would have testified, it wouldn't have made any difference. Not the point, Mr. Bolton. The national nightmare would certainly still be going on. the Democrats would still be talking about Trump impeachment this evening. And most importantly, all this would tie up the White House from taking on some very important issues like the coronavirus pandemic, among others. Mr. Bolton, now I want to talk to you directly. I never in a million years thought I would be calling you out as being a sleazeweasel. Beth and I were sitting 10 feet away from you and Tucker the last time you were on Tucker's show. Shortly before that, he had begun chastising you as basically an unreliable warmonger. This is one of the few things that I've ever disagreed with Tucker on. I've watched you for years and always thought your interpretation of good foreign policy was correct. I was shocked when Tucker started taking you to task. But now I see that Tucker Carlson was right about you all along, sir. You are just another swampy lowlife who would sell the future of your country out to the minions of Satan for a few pieces of silver. Beth and I are so disappointed in you and your traitorous behavior. Be gone to a fat CNN contract and eternal political damnation. I'm still reporting from just outside the citadel of American freedom. Good day. Gold is sitting near a a halt over the coronavirus. But let's start with Laura Ingram's great interview last night. Last night, Laura hammered Dr. Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, for insisting that we should believe Chinese researchers on the coronavirus outbreak there.
How should U.S. medical officials respond to a crisis as this coronavirus is spreading? Joining me now is Dr. Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. Dr. Fauci, it's great to see you. When China says that the rate of infections is slowing, why should we actually believe them when billions, if not trillions of dollars is riding on preserving the idea that all is going to be okay?
Well, you know, Laura, I think early on in the outbreak, it was clear that there was some muddling of information, but over the last several weeks, the Chinese authorities have really been very explicit that they were going to not tolerate any misinformation going out because they really was clear that no one was believing them. And I think they're very sensitive to that right now. The other issue that's important is that the WHO has finally gotten a team of people, an international group, to go over there. So they're going to have eyes, ears, and boots on the ground to be able to look and verify these things. So right now, at this point in time, I believe those numbers.
Dr. Fauci, you know, I love you, but you're believing a regime that has 1 million people tonight in re-education camps that have collars around their necks in the videos that we've seen. They torture Christians. They drive women to clinics to abort their babies if they have too many babies. And we're sitting around saying, oh, yeah, we believe, oh, it could have been caused by a rabid bat. And, oh, no, just because there was a level 4 lab in the vicinity, it couldn't have been. I just think I'm surprised that you would say that, given what we know about China's pattern of lying about critical issues, Dr. Fauci.
Dr. Fauci makes it clear that he's talking about his medical peers in China, folks he knows and has dealt with for years. He very carefully draws the distinction between the medical people and the political people. However, the problem is that the medical people are talking to him in confidence, and he knows darn good and well that he can't reveal any info that would get them into trouble. Because getting into trouble in this environment means getting locked in a room full of people with coronavirus. But Laura, to her great credit, keeps pushing in a way that I've never seen her do before. She has seen the same videos we have. She knows we're not being told the whole truth, at least by the Chinese regime.
But Laura, let me explain. There's Chinese officials, party people, and there's Chinese scientists. The Chinese scientists I've dealt with myself personally for years, if not decades. Many of them have trained here in the United States. Now, today, when we communicate with them, which we do almost on a daily basis, I'm going to be on a conference call tomorrow with a couple of them. I have faith that they are not distorting things. Now, what the party leaders do, I can't address. That's not what I do. But at a medical to medical level, I can believe my colleagues there. And what they're telling me now, I think, is the truth.
Again, Laura may not understand the fine line Dr. Fauci is walking. He's saying his medical peers are telling him the truth. He never says that the rulers of China are telling him the truth.
So, Dr. Fauci, let's say, the Chinese government makes it clear to one of the top scientists. I mean, one of the guys who, blew the alarm on this is dead. First, he's dead. Okay, we can't talk to him. We can't follow up with him. He's gone. As the head of the hospital, gone. But obviously, the Chinese government has a way of putting pressure on individuals who are artists, who are working in a variety of areas in the United States at American universities. They're committing espionage, doing all sorts of things because of fear of what they're going to do to their families back home. And again, I would ask this question: how do we rely on a regime that controls all aspects of information, movement, immigration, education, all of it, with an iron fist? I'd love to believe everybody out of China, but unfortunately, we don't have the CDC inside of China tonight or today or whatever time it is in China to give us the facts. We'll have the World Health Organization, but not the CDC, correct?
Well, right
Correct?
Now there is no, that's not correct, as a matter of fact.
They're not allowed.
And we're letting the...
Okay, go ahead.
No, it's not correct. It's not correct to say that.
Look at this guy. Something is very wrong with him. I've seen Dr. Fauci dozens of times on TV over the years. Something is wrong.
It's not correct to say
So
that.
they have unfettered access to all the information they need, the Centers for Disease Control, our people, or is it just part of the WHO?
It's a WHO international group of respected scientists who I know personally, and they are there right now.
Aha! Laura hit the nail on the head. The WHO is already in China to some extent, not the CDC. Several experts have mentioned that the WHO is not to be trusted in this matter. They know what China's been up to, and they have not revealed it in the past. The WHO cannot be trusted. Is that what Dr. Fauci is hiding?
Unfortunately, we don't have the CDC inside of China tonight or today or whatever time it is in China to give us the facts. We'll have the World Health Organization, but not the CDC, correct?
It's not correct to say
so
that.
They have unfettered access to all the information they need, the Centers for Disease Control, our people, or is it just part of the WHO?
It's a WHO international group of respected scientists who I know personally, and they are there right now.
So unfortunately, Laura just caught Dr. Fauci in a lie. Let's go to the videotape.
Unfortunately, we don't have the CDC inside of China tonight or today or whatever time it is in China to give us the facts. We'll have the World Health Organization, but not the CDC, correct?
It's not correct to say
so
that.
They have unfettered access to all the information they need, the Centers for Disease Control, our people, or is it just part of the WHO?
It's a WHO international group of respected scientists who I know personally, and they are there right now.
Nailed him, counselor. Boy, look at Laura. She is all over this guy. Then look at mousy Dr. Fauci. He is totally on his heels trying to hide the fact that there are no CDC people on the ground in China yet. Only the complicit WHO people who are friends with Dr. Fauci too. Laura is really coming into her own as a master cross-examine her to get at the truth. We're going to see more and more of this as she matures in this job.
So you're satisfied with all of the transparency coming out of China today about the trajectory of the disease and the origin of the disease?
Now watch how Dr. Fauci gets snippy with her.
Laura, I cannot say that I am satisfied with every single bit of information, but I can tell you in my direct interaction with Chinese scientists and Chinese health officials, not party politics people, but medical people and scientists, that I can believe what they're telling me.
So, Dr. Fauci, we wish you and your team all the best. This is a critical issue, and we just want people to remain safe and people to actually have verified information, because lives are on the line. A lot of people in China are suffering. We're reading all the stuff that's somehow being snuck out of China, and it's disturbing.
Bravo, Laura. I think that's the best cross-examination interview I've ever seen. So YouTube has now demonetized my last 2 videos on coronavirus. On the flip side, I've got leftist trolls badgering me in comments that I'm daring to run ads on such an important health concern. I'm not like Bernie, claiming to have an everything is free magic wand in my pocket, when really some Soros-like figure is pumping money into his back pocket. There is rarely much money in pure truth. So if you aren't buying products from our faithful advertisers, or providing minimal donations to support this channel, or donating through my Patreon page, then please don't complain. I'm still reporting from just outside the citadel of American freedom. Good day.